Good evening. This is Dialogue, a podcast of the Lenten preaching series recorded live at Calvary Episcopal Church in Memphis. I'm Paul McLean, Associate Rector here at Calvary, and tonight my guest is Canon Stephanie Spellers, Episcopal Presiding Bishop Michael Curry's Canon for Evangelism, Reconciliation, and Creation Care. She is a former church planter and seminary faculty member. Canon Spellers is also the author of Radical Welcome, Embracing God, the Other, and the Spirit of Transformation. In her most recent book, The Church Cracked Open, Disruption, Decline, and New Hope for Beloved Community. And both these books are available from our pop-up novel bookstore stand. And Stephanie let me know that she'll be available for a little while to sign books and visit with you after the podcast. Stephanie, welcome to Memphis.
Thank you so much, Paul. Appreciate it.
Great to have you here. And it's a kind of an auspicious day for you to be here. We just learned today that March 9th was the anniversary, 1892, of the People's Grocery lynching, where three people who had started a grocery store that was truly to be a people's grocery for African American people, and to feel like that they had a place where they would be welcome to go to a grocery store, were killed. Apparently the store was set up near where a rival white-owned grocery store, and there was a lot of contention about that. And the Ida B. Wells, who made her mark as a journalist, covered this story and really put the eyes of the world on Memphis and this whole situation. And it really brought a lot of awareness to lynching. And this, when people like our Lynching Sites Project and others are working in this area, this is one of the stories, that apocryphal stories they tell. But just it may be in hearing that story and your research in The Church Cracked Open, which really looked at a lot of the 2020 racial atrocities and injustices, what do you see in the connection past and present with some of those events? What does that conjure up for you?
Well, thank you for the good question, and I'm so sorry that this is it's a moment when, like, somewhere in Memphis, like, the streets are crying still. Yeah. And so that's, my heart breaks knowing that. And I'm grateful that we know. I'm grateful that we know, because the only way that we're going to heal, the only way to get free, is if we tell the truth. And I think as we tell the truth, one of the things that emerges, one of the truths that emerges, is that we are still living in many of the same patterns. You know, that so much has changed. Amen. So much has changed. And there are still some fundamentals, especially about just American life and about white supremacy. And you know, the idea that America was built for the flourishing of white people. It just was. There's no counter narrative to that. And that what that means is that the systems in America, even when people might have had good intentions, unless they were really, really intentional about dismantling that bent toward toward white supremacy, it controlled. And so you have the lynchings, that you all are remembering this day, because the idea that black people would own a business that might compete with a white business was enough to get 3 black people killed. Like just to think about, like, you wouldn't do that to a dog that was, like in front of a store, making it a little bit hard for people to get inside. And then we fast forward to 2020 and George Floyd, but also Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery. And we've just seen, the trial. Many of us just saw the trial, thank God, of Ahmaud Arbery's murderers. But we didn't know how that was going to go. Like, we were watching and wondering, what are they going to say? How could that set of facts be in front of a jury and everything had to line up to get a guilty verdict? And we didn't know that it would happen. So that same prioritization of white stories, that same assumption that, well, if white people did something, must have had a reason to do it, and it must have been a good reason. And the assumption that if a black person or a Latino person or an Asian person or you name it does something and somehow is harmed, then the assumption is, well, they must have done something to deserve it. So that pattern is still there, Paul. It's still there. It still plays out, and people are still dying as a result.
And it is. There's a tremendous sadness and chill that you feel when you think about that.
Yeah.
And
we should.
Right.
Again, I know that there are folk who want to sweep these stories under the rug. I know that there are folks who are like, well, but if you love America, you'll want America to, to be able to move on. But it's like you can't move on until you've reckoned with your past and your present. Again, we're not just talking about things that were back in the day somewhere. These are patterns that still operate today. So to sweep it all under the rug is actually to pretend something is not happening around us. And it's not a mature way of living.
No,
it's like, la, 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 la. I can't hear you, la, la, la. It's like, it's still going to happen, even if your fingers are in your ears. Like, it's what we would say to a child.
Absolutely.
It's like, time to deal, sweetie, and you're strong enough to deal.
Yeah. Well, one of the things I loved about your book, The Church Cracked Open, you take us into stories in a different way, and I see things that I've never seen before. And even with the biblical story that serves as maybe a basis for the narrative is the story of a woman with this alabaster jar of ointment who comes in to anoint Jesus. It appears in all 4 Gospels. And I've always thought of that as just this beautiful expression of love, of her pouring oil on Jesus' hair, and what a lovely, beautiful tribute of love that is. But you really looked at the scripture more deeply and saw it as a moment of disruption of a dinner party in a very profound way. Tell us what you see in that story.
Do you mind if I read it?
Please.
May I read this
absolutely.
passage for y'all? So that's why I wasn't texting, I was pulling up the passage.
My Southern Baptist grandma said, I can't believe you Episcopalians actually read 4 Bible verses every Sunday. So go on.
And we read them on our phones.
That's right.
So this is a reading from the Gospel of Mark, chapter 14, verses 3 to 9. While Jesus was at Bethany in the house of Simon the leper, as he sat at the table, a woman came with an alabaster jar of very costly ointment of nard, and she broke open the jar and poured the ointment on his head. But some were there who said to one another in anger, "Why was the ointment wasted in this way? This ointment could have been sold for more than 300 denarii and the money given to the poor." And they scolded her. But Jesus said, "Let her alone. Why do you trouble her? She's performed a good service for me. You'll always have the poor with you, and you can show kindness to them whenever you wish. But you will not always have me. She has done what she could. She has anointed my body beforehand for its burial. Truly, I tell you, wherever the good news is proclaimed in the whole world, what she has done will be told in remembrance of her." Like everybody here, March 2 years ago, I see the nodding, like go back in time with me. Like 2 years ago, about now, we were just getting the news. Churches were just having to, and just towns, everybody was just having to say, like, what is this thing that's going around? What's happening? And within a few weeks, a couple of weeks, I guess, Lent had begun, and our doors were closing, and folks were freaking out with very good reason. And somewhere in the mix of all of that, I landed with this passage. And it felt like it spoke so profoundly, so directly to the moment that I was watching unfold in front of us. This moment where it felt like something really precious had just gotten broken, cracked open. And that precious thing was our church. That precious thing was our country, our national understanding, our identity. This was also, by this time, post George Floyd, post the murder of George Floyd. But so many things were falling apart all around. And I just kept coming back to this passage and feeling like God is telling us something here. And God's telling us a lot of things in here. You know, that once upon a time, there was a woman, and she broke in. She broke into this gathering that she was not supposed to be a part of. She hadn't been invited. A woman would never have been welcome in that space. She went anyway. And then she doesn't just come in order to feed the men or do whatever it was appropriate for a woman to do. She comes in, and she has this precious alabaster jar, like in itself a very expensive thing. And the contents are costly nard, which we learn in the passage is worth about 300 denarii, which is about a year's wages. For some perspective, in case you have not traded in denarii of late. So, if you don't have denarii in your back pocket, right? So there's so many layers of scandal, so many layers of outrageous, so many layers of wake up that are getting enacted in what this woman does. And like so much of Scripture, we read it and we're like, okay, moving on. It's like, don't move on. Stay with her. Something just happened here. And the thing that's happening feels a lot like what's happening with us. It's like, I imagine those men looking at the pieces of the alabaster jar and the oil all around and feeling like, we got to scoop it up. We got to get those pieces. We got to put them back together as closely as possible, resembling the original jar. We've got to get this oil. We've got to get it back into the jar. Why did she pour that out? She had no business. She had no right. And wasn't that a little of what we felt about our own churches? We got to get it back to where it was. We got to get back in the building. We've got to get, so that we can hear the organ and see the acolytes and have all of the signs of church. Instead of realize that actually a lot of the stuff that we were clinging to and calling church was about the building. It was about the trappings. It wasn't about Jesus. It wasn't about us being transformed into the likeness of Christ. It wasn't about repentance. It wasn't about following the way of love. It was about church the way that we've constructed it. And it got broke. And especially for the Episcopal Church, a lot of church as we've constructed it has, there's a story in how our church even gets founded. And it's a story, like the ground that we are built on is, it's the ground of empire. It's the ground of white supremacy. So it's like, maybe if those are the things that are on the ground in pieces, don't put them back. Just a thought,
Good thought.
Like you don't have to put that alabaster jar together in the same way. The church that we become from here on, we actually have some choices. And we could put Jesus at the center of it instead of white supremacy at the center of it. And we could put love at the center instead of empire at the center. And we could put others at the center instead of self at the center. So that's the hope that drove me to write this book. But it's a hope that really gets captured in that passage.
Yeah. It's a powerful image. And seeing that scripture alive and new for me, I will never read it again without thinking of the breaking of that jar.
Good. You can hear it.
You can hear it.
Smell it. You can feel it. Like some of those pieces probably went flying. Maybe there's a little blood on somebody. Like she did. She. Hopefully they were never the same. Yeah. And we won't be either.
Right. Well, today at your wonderful sermon, you mentioned one of our beloved friends here in Memphis, friend of this series, Phyllis Tickle.
Phyllis.
Yeah. And I want to just, you talk about her in the book as well, about her idea of the church. Her big metaphor is rummage sale.
Yes.
The church going through a rummage sale every 500 years. And before she died, she believed we were entering a new age that she called the age of the Spirit.
Yes.
And I wanted to hear from you, what do you think of that metaphor, that description of the age of the Spirit? Do you think, and perhaps the pandemic and the racial events that happened in 2020 or maybe contribute to us entering that age, but where do you see the age of the Spirit emerging in the church, and what does that look like?
Well, I need to give, I gave Sister Phyllis a shout out in the sermon, and what I remembered, actually just as we were prepping earlier, is that I after she passed away, there was a book of essays about her influence on the church and on culture and all of that. And I actually wrote one of those. And I had forgotten until just a moment ago. And it's a book called Phyllis, Tickle, Evangelist of the Future. And there were a number of us who contributed. And my role was to write the chapter on what she had meant to the Episcopal Church. So yes, Age of the Spirit. What's fun is if you listen to my boss, Bishop Michael Curry, talking, he often refers to Phyllis Tickle too. And he and I have had conversations about we're in the age of the Spirit. And we're fighting it. But it's happening. That there have been other ages when it was about control and structure and whatever it is that we were building, and ages that were more amenable or whatever, they fit better with God the Father. And then there have been these ages where where Jesus always speaks, but perhaps the age that is very focused on the church would be an age that's very kind of Jesus centered. And then there's this age of the Spirit where good luck predicting. Good luck. Good luck saying we've got it together. Good luck saying, well, we've mastered this, and now we will charge from point A to point G or whatever. You can barely get from A to B without getting sidetracked by just life, by truth, by everything. So yeah, I feel like like I said in my sermon, I feel like I still hear her voice, and I hear her laughing. I hear her laughing like, I told you. I told you. And I just, I talk a lot, actually, in the Church Cracked Open about the idea of stewardship of privilege, and that if you have privilege, say if you have racial privilege as a white person, I have clerical privilege. I have educational privilege because I've got a couple of master's degrees, and one of them is from a school that starts with H, near Boston, whatever. And so even though I'm the first in my family to go to college, so I'm working class from Appalachia, I've also got that other piece. So basically, I know that I have privilege. Everybody in here has some form of privilege. What are you going to do with it? How are you going to use your privilege? How are you going to leverage it for the sake of liberation? What I loved about Phyllis is that she leveraged being this white lady with white curly hair and her southern accent and her gracious ways, dropping bombs everywhere. Right? like Phyllis dropped bombs, stuff that she said I'd never get away with. She gave us cover. She gave us cover. She named what was happening so that those of us who were on the front lines could kind of get out there and get some stuff done instead of getting blown away. And to me, that's stewardship of privilege. I wish that I could find her now, and maybe I would thank you, Phyllis. Thank you for giving us cover and for naming that we are in this age of the Spirit, and for helping to decrease anxiety among people who would ordinarily be the ones who are no, you will not create these new forms or these re-enchanted forms of what is ancient. You will not. You will do it this way. And she created this room for us to explore and to say yes to the Spirit. And I wish that other folk whatever your privilege, use it so that you can say the thing that somebody else gets dismissed for. Use it in order to show up in the spaces where, like, everybody looks at that space, that community, and says, oh, well, nothing good comes from there. But if one of you shows up and is a listener, if one of you shows up and says, well, but I've gained a lot by being in relationship with this community, then a lot of other people who respect you and or share your identity will have to look twice. Stewardship of privilege.
Yeah.
Like, that's of the many, many, many things I'm grateful to Phyllis for. I'm grateful for her work identifying and inviting us into the age of the Spirit. And I'm extraordinarily grateful, and I realize it even as we're sitting here, for how she stewarded her privilege.
Right. And I love that when you do talk about beloved community, and I want you to maybe tell us a little more about that phrase, and I know that's a big phrase for the presiding bishop, but for you as well. And but you always, or you move us from saying being beloved community to becoming beloved community. And that's kind of a Holy Spirit thing,
That's not
too.
accidental.
No. Well, tell us why it's so important that we understand this as becoming beloved community rather than we all want to just be it.
Right. Boy, I guess it was I can't remember when it was. It must have been, I guess, in the 80s or 90s. But Sandra Day O'Connor was on the Supreme Court, and she was hearing a case about affirmative action. And the case eventually went for affirmative action, like she voted for it. But she asked the question, how much longer are we going to need to have this? And what that pointed to for me is that we don't know how to stay. We want to know, how soon can we be done? How soon can we arrive? And she wanted to be able to declare, and bless her heart, I was so grateful that she just said it, you know? You're like sitting there on the Supreme Court, but genuinely wondering, like, how long will I as a white person have to acknowledge that these systems are still operative? Because I'm tired and I don't want to talk about it anymore. You know? That was Sandra Day O'Connor. And that's a lot of the folk in our churches, a lot of the folk in our school systems, a lot of the folk just in our lives who just want to arrive. And they're like, but I have good intentions, so isn't that enough? No. I'm not a racist. Isn't that enough? No. That it's not enough to say I'm not racist. It's not enough to say that I appreciate beloved community. We actually have to be on a road actively dismantling racism, actively dismantling white supremacy in the life of our church. We have to be actively resisting forces that have been around longer than anybody in this room, longer than this room. I hear that Calvary was the oldest building in Memphis, is that right? So white supremacy is older than that. It's older than anything you can point to around here. So of course we're becoming. And we just need to relax and realize that there's no shame in that. I think a lot of folk, like, we want to be able to master things. We want to be done. We want to be good. We want to be able to say that we fixed it. You know, and I'm a fixer. Like, my dad left when I was 7 years old, and I remember when I was 9, I was already slipping budgets under my mother's door because I heard her crying, and I knew that the money wasn't adding up. At 9 years old, I knew that, and I was fixing. And I've spent my life fixing. Any clergy in the house? Raise your hand if you're a clergy. Are you a fixer? Yeah. Any therapists in the house? You're fixers too. Yeah, just like we see something broken, we want to be able to fix it. And it needs to be okay that we're not going to be able to fix this and be beloved community. We are on the road, and God is with us on the road. And so just take the shame away. You know, take the stigma away. I mean, it's the same thing where people really freak out when you're like, you know, like when you use the word racist. They're like, but I'm not racist, I'm not. It's like, well, the worst thing in the world is not being called a racist. Something bad is participating in racist systems. Like, that's bad. But everybody is so terrified of being shamed. It's like, can we just name what is without all the weight of it? It's like, yeah, that thing was racist. And now that we know that, we can work on it. Instead of the shame and the guilt that get associated with certain words, or associated with becoming instead of being. Does that make sense?
It makes a lot of sense.
Good,
Yeah,
good.
yeah.
I think we need grace.
Right.
I think we need space for grace. We need space to be able to say, I have no idea.
Yeah.
I don't know what to do next. I'm a good, well-meaning white person, and I don't know what my next steps are.
Right.
That's okay. Yeah. Nobody's asking you to have the answers. In fact, if you said you had the answers, I'd be scared. It's like, oh, shit.
No.
Now they think they have the answers. We're in trouble.
Yeah.
This is not something to master. This is something to heal over time, together. Yeah. So breathe. In fact, everybody who's here, and if you're listening on the podcast, just feel free to take a deep breath. Take another one. They're free. Wow.
We need as many of those as we can.
To me, it's another part of why that idea of the church cracked open is so, I'm grateful to be able to hold this out to folks, because what we can say is, yeah, it's cracked open, now what? Mm-hmm. Instead of, it's not cracked open. Yeah. It's not cracked. Everything's fine. It's like, when you know it's not fine, stop clinging to the idea that it's okay. Mm-hmm. It's all right that a liturgy gets wonky. Yeah. It's okay that some of your live streams were really bad. Mm-hmm. It's all of these things are fine. God loves you enough to be with you when you suck at something, when you failed at something, and when you rock something. God's love actually doesn't waver in any of those phases. Mm-hmm. So can we just allow that to be? Yeah. I studied Buddhism before I studied Christianity.
Can tell,
yeah. And so I'm really big on, can you allow these things, these states of being to be without judging them, mm-hmm. and without trying to excise them from your being? Because if you can actually just allow the mud to settle, in that, instead of stirring it and feeling bad about it, we need to breathe in light of the truth. Mm-hmm. Yeah. In the full light, with the full weight of the truth, we need to be able to breathe.
Yeah. And speaking of the truth, in the book, you really do expose the Episcopal Church's complicity with empire. And especially, of course, with the practice of slavery, but also in relationship to indigenous peoples.
Yes.
And one of the surprising parts of the book, we talked a little bit about this earlier, and it was a shock to me, is the more truthful story you tell of the Episcopal Church not splitting into southern and northern denominations like many other churches did in the aftermath of the Civil War. We've always, or at least I've been taught, that the northern bishops kind of kept the southern bishops on the rolls, and so that there would be an easy, calm reconciliation, and we were so farsighted in doing that, and it was a beautiful story of how we did that, and none of the other churches were able to do it. But tell us the true story of that.
Talk about revisionist history. Yeah, when I was in seminary, I heard that story. I heard the narrative was that, almost every other major, certainly Protestant denomination in America split during the Civil War. The Methodist split, the Baptist split, the Presbyterian split, but we did not. Mm-hmm. And the story was that we were so committed to reconciliation and so committed to, the life of the gospel that we would not allow ourselves to be torn apart and our mission as God's people to be interrupted in this way. That we were bound, and that, we don't just split over anything. And then I did the research. And I had already learned some of this, but with Church Cracked Open, I spent months just deep in the bowels reading through the notes, through the minutes from the House of Bishops meetings during the Civil War. So that's where I learned, and reading, journal entries and things like that. I used to be a journalist, so I can go there. Like, I can just dig. So I kind of did my own investigative piece, really, about, so what's the real story of why we didn't split? And the real story is that the northern bishops were so embedded in the slave trade, had so much money riding, the northern churches had so much money riding on the slave trade, that if it had ended, if the Civil War had basically if slavery had ended, northern Episcopal churches would have lost massive amounts of wealth. What was also true is that northern and southern bishops were very close to one another. They had gone to the same schools. They sent their children back and forth to live with one another, spent summers with one another. And so, for instance, John Henry Hopkins, who was the Bishop of Vermont, he sent his son down south, regularly to work for the bishops in the south. So people, so when you look at him, you're like, now wait a second, and then you dig some more, and you're like, that's the dude who wrote the Bible View on Slavery, one of the most popular and erudite defenses of slavery from a biblical perspective. The Bishop of Vermont did that, not the Bishop of Alabama, not the Bishop of Tennessee, the Bishop of Vermont. And it's because they were so connected to one another that when those southern bishops said, leave it alone, the northern bishops were like, we got this. We were the church of the slavocracy, north and south. Why did we not split? Because we weren't torn, because we were in favor of slavery. Just sit with that for a second. That the reason the Episcopal Church did not split during the Civil War is because we weren't torn. There was not the conflict. We were on the side of slavery.
It's powerful. And it, again, just like the alabaster jar, just hearing that story again, I will never hear it the same way.
Yeah. And it makes you wonder, like, what are the ways that we have compromised the gospel again and again for the sake of an institution? What are the ways that we have compromised the truth of Jesus Christ because it didn't match up with the goals of empire? Over and over and over again. We have so much to repent of. There's so many pieces of this alabaster jar that is the Episcopal Church that do not need to come back.
Well, one of the things you did share that there were some shards of light through the alabaster jar in our history.
Gotta have those.
And you gave some names that I'd never heard before. John Jay II. Tell me who he was and why he was a shard of light in the midst of this.
So I taught a course at General Seminary that informed a lot of what's in this book. And the session that I did in that course on it was a course on reconciliation and solidarity in the Episcopal Church. And so I was kind of looking at our history, and part of that course was identifying, it's like, I need to be able to show these students some Episcopalians who didn't just follow that pattern, the pattern of complicity with white supremacy, with empire, with misogyny, with any number, just like you name it, with elitism. And so there were several that I was teaching about, but I chose 4 for the book. John Jay II is one of them. John Jay II was the grandson of John Jay, first Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court. So this was a dude with privilege. This was a dude with privilege. He had gone to Columbia University, trained to be an attorney. I think got his law license around when he was 20 years old. So a very accomplished young man. And from the word go, like even I think before he even had his law license, before he even completed law school, he was already out there working in order to secure freedom to keep the freedom of escaped slaves. And he just stayed that course. Even when the Episcopal Church in New York, he was living in New York City. The Episcopal Church in New York, again, I've read through the diocesan convention minutes where, like people are shouting him down. He's trying to make the case for why St. Philip's Episcopal Church, the first black church in New York, should be admitted to convention. And all of these folks are like, be quiet, be quiet. We're not going, a black church has no place in the councils of white people. Why would they be with us? Yes, we'd let them have a church, but no, they shouldn't actually be at our convention. And John Jay got up year after year after year. I think it was 7 or 8 years that he kept coming back to convention quoting scripture at people, just doing everything in order to make the case for this black church to be admitted into convention.
He never got a second for his motion, and he kept coming, and he kept talking.
Kept coming, kept talking, and actually, I think in 2019 or 2018, the Diocese of New York finally passed his resolution.
Wow.
FYI.
Yeah.
That's the Northern Church, FYI. But yeah, there's so many stories that you can tell about him and how he put his life on the line. He put his privilege on the line for the sake of liberation. And I found such hope in his story and in stories of folks like him. Again, not just around race. Vida Scudder is another, whose story some people might know. But Vida Scudder was, was a young woman she was alive from the 1800s into the 1900s. So she saw a lot going on, and she became Episcopalian as maybe, I think, like a teenager. And she had great wealth, she had education, she was one of the first women to attend, I think, either Oxford or Cambridge. So she could have cruised. Vida Scudder could have cruised. Instead, she became a socialist, and she ended up coming back to the States, teaching at Wellesley College, teaching women, and starting these settlement houses in the heart of Boston, among the poorest of the city. So she started these settlement houses. She lived in the houses with these poor women and their children. This woman with all this money, all this education. So she would go from Wellesley College and then come home and sleep at the settlement house. This Episcopal woman. And she prayed her way through all of it. I loved hearing the stories of how these radicals prayed their way to that place by the side of Jesus. And I love just this image that, actually, this is discipleship. This is what our church, if we were really following Jesus, these are the kinds of things that we would be doing. These are the risks we would be taking in our own contexts, whatever that looks like. But you can pray your way into a pretty radical space if you're not careful. Don't be careful.
Well, we've enjoyed this conversation. We are going to have some time for question and answer, but
cool.
We would like to close out, and it's been a lovely time with you, Stephanie.
Thank you so much.
Very provocative and very, very informative. Dialogue is a podcast of Calvary's Lenten preaching series, a 99-year-old tradition that invites wise and inspiring speakers into our pulpit during the season of Lent, and invites a few of them into this podcast to further the conversation. Dialogue is produced by Noah Glenn of Perpetual Motion. Our theme music was composed by Spence Bailey. Special thanks to Robin Banks, Director of Communications at Calvary, and Heidi Rupke, our Lenten Preaching Series Coordinator, and thanks to you for listening. If you're curious about the Home of Dialogue and the Lenten Preaching Series, Calvary Episcopal Church is an eclectic bunch of Christian people. We don't all think the same thoughts, or dress the same way, or vote for the same candidates, or even believe all the same things about the mystery of God and what it means to be human. But we do believe that we need each other because of our differences, not in spite of them, and that God calls us into unity, not uniformity. Subscribe to Dialogue at calvarymemphis.org/podcast or wherever you get your podcast, and visit Calvary in person at the corner of 2nd and Adams in the heart of downtown Memphis, Tennessee. Thank you. At this time, Heidi's available for those of you who have questions for Stephanie. And now that we're off the air, she can be even more candid.
It's like no one's recording. No one's recording.
And I apologize, I have more comments than questions, but
Please,
let's
say
see
it.
how this goes. You're absolutely right that the murder conviction of the officer in Minneapolis,
Yes,
everything
yes.
had to fit.
Yep.
Everything had to fit. Mr. Bush would agree with that, wouldn't you? Everything had to fit. But let's remember that that whole incident, from before it happened, before the knee hit the throat, and afterwards, was videoed on a phone by a teenage girl who kept running it and running it and running it, even though the police were telling her to get out of the way. And she had the courage to do it. And what was interesting to me about that was that the facts, if she wasn't there, the facts wouldn't have changed. But the facts didn't change at all, except it was visible and horrid and helped that verdict along.
Yeah.
That's a sad commentary, I think.
Yeah.
Okay, that's very sad. I have one other, and then you can say whatever you want.
Oh, please.
I love bomb throwers. And I'm not going to, I've been both. I've been a corporate guy and doing all of these things, but then I became a bomb thrower because it felt better. Bomb throwers don't raise money well because they want to get elected, and they don't get elected to anything because they don't have a constituency. But they tell the truth.
Yes.
And we used to say, listen to the bomb throwers, they tell the truth, and if they're being called radicals, listen to them carefully.
Amen. Nothing to add, just agreement, lots of nodding.
I was really interested as you were talking about the history of the church. I was wondering if you could say more about the relationship between the Episcopal Church and the AME. And I was thinking about this a few years back when several of them were being burned. And I raised that here before this group was here, another priest that I'll pick on who said, that doesn't have anything to do with us, kind of dismissively, you know, that's not our church. And I'm like, but that, the history that created all of this and what we have obviously created that. And I do feel like we have an obligation to those churches.
There are a number of us who, who've kind of watched the ecumenical dialogues that our church is involved in, you know, the strides we've taken in common mission with the Lutheran Church, moving toward communion with the Methodists, you know, maybe we've established it, I can't remember. You know, like, you name, like, there's so many churches that we have established communion with or relationships with, conspicuously not the one that has the word Episcopal in its name. African Methodist Episcopal is what you're talking about, the AME church. And it's, I just kind of watch it and was like, how about that? You know, that when we're out there looking for partners, we just conveniently look over the group, you know, that has Episcopal and presumably some of our history as a part of its own history. And in fact, I mean, there's a little kind of historic piece that's just important to note, which is that when the Methodists broke from the Episcopalians, they were called Methodist Episcopalians. So the ME in AME is actually referring to, it's what Methodists would have been called at the time. So it was basically African Methodists. So it's also important to note that, it's not that they necessarily broke, the AME was not a child of or a descendant of the Episcopal Church. It was a couple of generations down, or through. But, and still, like, I remember going to an AME church when I was growing up, like the few times my mom could get me to church. And I used to like pretend that I had a cold on Sundays whenever Mom would want to take us to church. I'd be like, oh my God, I'm so sick, Mom. So this, I just find funny now. It's like, I can't get out of church anymore. But we would go to an AME church. And I remember looking around and being like, wow, the AMEs tend to be among black Protestants, tend to be the more educated, tend to be more formal in their worship, tend to, have the best cars in the parking lot. I remember that. I remember all of this because I actually felt kind of out of place with the AMEs. And so I sit and I watch them like, y'all, if there's anybody who gets us, like in the black fold, it's AMEs. So maybe we ought to do some relationship building with them. They are also dying. They are also trying to figure out how to get beyond their ties to formalism and their rejection of evangelism and anything that's remotely Baptist. Like they have the same hang-ups that we have, and they're trying to get over them. Like, we could learn a lot.
We had a very fruitful partnership at Trinity Episcopal Cathedral in Little Rock with Bethel AME Church, which was just down the road from us. And we had signed a covenant agreement back in the 90s. But we really wanted to make that more than just something on paper. And it was really turned into it's still going, a very fruitful relationship. And there are probably a lot of things we could do on the local level. But I agree that a national dialogue between the churches would be wonderful.
But I think local, regional, like, let it be there. Let it be, your diocese or Calvary, connecting with a major AME church and just learning together. Not just doing the, like, preaching in each other's pulpits is fine, but there's something about actually showing up, like the rest of the congregation, the rest of y'all showing up and being hosted, kind of learning with them. And, but allow their struggles to be your struggles and allow their wisdom to shape you. Why not?
Other questions?
I think I saw it right over here.
I have a show I like to watch sometimes. It's on PBS, and it's Henry Louis Gates, and he does he takes families and he goes back to their past, and he really goes far back. And I remember one particular show in which he had someone who felt quite bad about some revelations about his ancestors that he didn't particularly feel very good about. And he said, "You don't inherit that." I just remembered that. Says, they were feeling quite bad. He says, "Whoa, you don't inherit that."
Yeah. What do you think he meant by that?
Well,
you don't inherit.
You don't inherit
that. What do you think he meant?
The guilt that they were feeling, I don't think that he wants to reveal what actually happened in a non-judgmental way, and then he lets you deal with that. But he doesn't want you to feel necessarily guilty about these things in the past, that you don't inherit that. And I just thought that was a great comment. I always remembered it, so I mentioned that, because we talk about history and we don't like to think about some of those things, but I just thought that was a great comment.
I think especially these days, it's like what you've just named is like, we need to find a healthy relationship with those stories. And I don't like guilt. I don't find it especially useful. Well, I don't like shame. Let me be clear. I don't like shame. I think that shame paralyzes people. I think that it's a way of controlling people, punishing people. Shame, no. Guilt, When it starts tilting toward shame, no. Guilt as awareness of complicity. It's like, I know when I feel guilty about some things, I don't know if anybody else has experienced this, when I know I've done something wrong, or that I'm connected to something that was done wrong, I feel this warm shiver. It's like my head starts to sizzle, and my stomach starts rolling, and I don't want that feeling. I don't want that feeling. But maybe I need to learn to sit with that too. Like we were talking about breathing earlier, how can I sit with that warm sizzle and know that actually there are things that I have been complicit in, and there are things that happened in the past, but that make my life better today. That's one of the keys, and actually we do inherit that. Like you don't inherit, like you haven't inherited the slaves, but many of you, and actually if you're white in America, you have, even if you came from immigrant stock who never or weren't even around at that time, you have inherited the privilege, you have inherited the assumption of intelligence, the assumption of goodwill, the assumption of innocence, the assumption that you've inherited, the background that is familiar with home ownership. You have because once upon a time, there was a GI Bill and other things that were basically welfare for white veterans. And that's how the middle class was born. It didn't just happen. We were basically an oligarchy before that. But like some wise folks said, we need to spread this around, and they used the GI Bill and lots of other things in order to make it possible for white folks to have homes and to have nice homes, and that made it possible for the suburbs to even be born at all. And that's the basis for so much of white security in America now. And so it's like, yeah, you didn't own slaves, but there's a lot of stuff besides slaves we need to be talking about. There's redlining. There's public schools in this very moment. There's the fact that a lot of our Episcopal schools were, became havens right after Brown versus Board of Education. A number of our Episcopal schools became havens for folks who did not want their white children in school with black children. And so you can see spikes in the attendance at white schools, or at Episcopal schools, based on when they were trying to desegregate. So, didn't inherit? No, absolutely, don't get mired in guilt, because that paralysis doesn't do anybody any good. But realize that there is complicity in these systems, and that you have actually inherited something. And that unless you are actively dismantling these systems and figuring out how to leverage that privilege for the sake of liberation, then actually some guilt is okay. It's appropriate.
Well, I think we're about out of time. I did want you to just say a little bit about the third part of your title, Creation Care. We talked a little bit about that.
You want to just do a swerve like that?
Yeah, well,
like,
unfortunately,
what about that Earth? Yeah.
Well, that could probably be a whole other topic.
Indeed,
but I
indeed.
think what happens is what I just did is, I think because evangelism, because of declining numbers in churches, we emphasize that.
Yep.
Because of
Yep.
the racial things that we saw, George Floyd, we emphasize racial reconciliation. But
Yeah.
creation care, that's always on the back burner.
Yeah, yeah.
And how do we move it to the front burner?
Yeah. Well, there's a person sitting right now at the by the windows over there who just walked in. Hey, Arkansas, how you doing, girl? Woohoo! The person who just pulled in to the parking lot and walked in is Jerusalem Greer.
Yeah.
She is the staff officer for the whole Episcopal Church for evangelism. But one of the things that she has done that I am so grateful for is that she has worked with the Creation Care Department to create something called Good News Gardens, which is like among the many things that Good News Gardens accomplishes, it has literally moved creation care from that back burner space, from the place where it's like, unless you are a rabid, like tree hugger, what's creation care got to do with you? And these Good News Gardens have become this way for just regular church folks who love earth, love gardens, love growing life, to be able to connect that with their faith and then to share their faith. That's the good news part of it. And then for just this wonderful kind of cycle to keep going, that now you can invite people who have nothing to do with church, but sure do love a garden, to have these conversations and to engage. And so we're trying to create these ways in. I'm a realist. So, there are a lot of folk who want to be all, like lovey-dovey and dreamy about, well, but we should care about the environment, or we should care about evangelism. It's like, well, since we don't, what are we going to do? So let's start from there and then move forward instead of shooting people to death, or shooting people into silence. So that's a big part of what I'm trying to do and what our team is trying to do, is to meet folks where they are, find the things that they already have this passion and open heart for, and then use that as a way into the deeper commitment to justice and care for creation and for the people who are most vulnerable on this earth, whose lives don't matter much more than the land itself. So that's. Thank you for the swerve. Thank you for that,
welcome.
Paul.
You're welcome. Well, thank you for being with us tonight. Let's hear it one more time for Canon Stephanie. And she pre-signed a few of the books, and she'll be around to sign more books and to visit for a little while. Thank you all.
Thank you so much. Yay.